Dedication. This book is dedicated to the fine people of my role-playing group. Blake Found, Brandon Dufour, Luke Reed, Adam Fry, Kenny Wilson, Miley Perkins, Nick Pybus, Matt Pofurl, and Ryan Hirenga. Thank you so much for helping to design the characters that now populate my fictional world, and sorry for all the emotional trauma that I put you through. This book is also dedicated to Misty Dawn Weir for helping push me to get the first draft finished. This book may never have seen the light of day without you. Finally, last but certainly not least, thank you to my mother for helping shape me as a reader and eventually a writer. Who knows where I'd be if I'd never seen Spot run. Prelude, A Dangerous Road. Sakana sat huddled by the fire, with his wife and child, pulling his cloak tight against his shoulders to ward off the cold wind blowing through the mountain pass. He looked up at the sheer rock faces on either side of them, cold and opposing against the small family. He felt so temporary and unimportant against the timeless rocks. These stood in contrast to the winding and worn path that formed naturally between them, at points thin enough for the family to struggle to bring their cattle through, but wide enough here to make a fire and give their feet and their animals a rest. He sat upon the cold, hard stone that had already made him sore. His feet were no better off, his boots feeling tight and uncomfortable after a full day's walk. He rubbed his calloused hands together anxiously, running their plans through his mind once more. The prospect of moving his entire family from Fardale to find their own farmland had been one they had not come easily to. After many stressful conversations with his wife Taryn, they had decided they could no longer remain just farmhands and sustain their growing family. His wife sat with his young son Saken on the other side of the fire, chatting and laughing. Taryn was telling Saken about the time when Sakana was courting her and fell off his horse in the mud. It did Sakana's heart well to hear their joyful laughter. "You should have seen him," Taryn said between laughs with her soft, sweet voice. "He stood up and shook it off and tried to pretend nothing happened. He just grabbed the reins and hopped back on his horse." She glanced over at him with a smile. "And then I looked at him and I couldn't hold it in anymore. I just started laughing at him, sitting up so straight and serious on that horse, covered in mud from head to toe. Then he looked back at me with a smile on his face and began to laugh himself. That, my son, is when I knew that this man was worthy of my love." She smirked at Sakana, warming his heart. He remembered that day too, her wide laughing smile and her messy brown hair bouncing on her shoulders. She refused to put her hair up if ever she could avoid it. She always told him that it was an expression of who she was, that her hair should be as free as she felt. He was beginning to see the signs of life wearing on her skin, but there was a new kind of beauty to his wife, the beauty of the familiar, the beauty of knowing someone so completely. Saken was the expression of the two of them together, with his wife's free spirit, but already showing the hard-working attitude of his father, even in his adolescence. He also had his father's looks, dark hair and light blue eyes. His son had also worked with him in the stables, and Sakana had been teaching him as much as he could to prepare him for the new responsibility of running their own small farm. It was a long and difficult journey ahead of them, and Sakana knew it would likely be generations before their hard work truly began to pay off. The troubled father looked down the path that was still ahead of them, growing tense with worry once more. He wondered if this was the right thing to do to his wife and child. Was the freedom worth the risk? Should he have stayed in his homeland where it was safe and he knew his place? He had worried only a little while when a soft touch met his shoulder, startling him out of his distant stare. "Dear, the sun has almost set, and we have a long day ahead of us tomorrow. Perhaps we should make camp here for the night, and get some rest so that we can get an early start tomorrow," his wife told him, with a kind smile on her face. "Besides, perhaps you'll worry less in your sleep," she said knowingly. "You're right," he said with a sigh as he stood to his feet. "Let's pitch our tent quickly. My tired bones are ready for some sleep." The family quickly finished the familiar ritual of putting together their tent for a night's rest. As they climbed back into their humble bedrolls, Sakana's mind went back to worry. He laid awake for most of the night, his love asleep with her head lying softly on his chest, his pride sleeping peacefully a few feet away. After what seemed like countless hours, Sakana fell asleep watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his son's chest. Sakana awoke suddenly and forcefully from his sleep to the sound of his tent being torn from the ground and tossed aside. Before his eyes even had a chance to adjust, Sakana grasped at the sword he had placed by his bedside. A heavy boot came down hard on his arm, sending severe pain coursing through him, jarring him to wakefulness. Standing above him was the hideous, scarred face of a Desh. The Desh were born each with disfiguring scars all over their features to mark them to everyone they met. The ruined tent was surrounded by at least a dozen of them, with raised swords and smug grins. Sakana heard squeals of anguish as some of them buried their blades into the cattle that they had worked so hard to bring from Fardale. Blood splashed the dirt and seeped from beneath the poor creatures as they went silent. "Ha! Looks like our lucky night," the foul creature standing on his arm said to his comrades. "I was getting so bored with no one foolish enough to come through the mountains. Looks like we have us some playthings." He spread his lips in a nasty smile that spread from cheek to cheek. Sakana's stomach twisted with anger and disgust. Suddenly, Sakana felt them pulling his wife from his arms, and he grabbed her with his free hand as hard as he could. She looked at him with panic in her deep brown eyes as the Desh pulled her with great force. Sakana felt a strength like he never had before, all of his love and adrenaline working to give him the power to counter the two Desh that now pulled against him. Hope left him, and his heart dropped in his chest as a third Desh brought down his sword on Terran's arm. The sickening sound of the blade cutting through flesh and breaking bone resounded in Sakana's ears, a sound that would be forever in his mind. Terran's severed hand went limp in his own, and he dropped it to the ground. For a moment, Terran simply looked at the blood gushing everywhere with shock, until finally she screamed with pain. The Desh standing on Sakana's arm moved his foot and lifted Sakana to his knees. The other Desh did the same to Terran and Saken. One of them struck Terran's face with the back of his hand, crying, "Silence!" Terran obeyed. She began to softly weep, her eyes closed, and blood all over her nightclothes. "Well, well, how should we punish this man for being foolish enough to bring his family through our mountains?" the Desh behind him asked his men. "Kill him and his stinking family," one of the Desh cried. "I say we keep him. I haven't tortured anyone in ages," another one responded. "Yeah, we'll make him watch and then keep him later for fun," a third Desh said with a sneer on his twisted face. Sakana's heart pounded as he watched the Desh laugh and sneer at the prospect of torturing his beloved family. He couldn't sit by and let this happen. Inside, he felt the struggle between his desire to do anything he could to save his family and his knowledge that he was far too weak to prevail against them. He took a deep breath and narrowed his eyes. Sakana found his courage again, and with as much force as he could, threw his head back against the Desh who was holding him, causing him to let go. Pain flooded his head and blurred his eyes, but driven by anger and desperation, Sakana reached for the sword sheathed at the Desh's side. Sakana was thrown onto his back as the much faster, trained warrior struck him in the stomach forcefully with his knee. "You disgusting little swine! You're only calling down more wrath on yourself. Now sit and watch. This will be the last thing your stinking eyes will see," the head Desh cried out in bitter anger. "Restrain him," he called to his subordinates. The Desh held him tight, holding his eyes wide open as they forced his wife and son to their knees in front of them. Sakana felt his mind go numb, and reality seemed to fade around him as the blades of the scarred creatures sliced through the throat of his wife, her blood pouring out on the ground in front of him. He heard his son cry out in a scream of anguish before the hateful Desh repeated the same to him. As Saken fell dead to the ground, suddenly a blade was forced into Sakana's eyes as he heard himself scream, as an unbelievable pain flooded all of his senses. All was red, and soon faded to black. Sakana felt the world begin to slip away as he lost consciousness. His mind flooded with pain, anguish, and terror. He could no longer make sense of the world around him. As the Desh dragged him away, Sakana felt one last powerful emotion for his wife and son: envy.